We're going to continue our study of God revealing himself to the Israelites and Moses. And we're going to look at today, or actually the title of today is, I Am Powerful Proclaimer. Basically, what we mean by that is what God says will be done. He has the power to do what he says he wants done. You know, and God's power could never be overcome by another. Now, last week where we left off our study, the nation of Israel was at the promised land, kind of at the doorstep of the promised land. God had told them to go on and take it. You know, it's yours. I gave it to you. You know, go up and take the land. And the people wanted to send in spies first. They wanted to see what they were going to be up against. And God allowed them to send 12 spies into the promised land, one from each tribe. And if you remember, the spies came back. 10 of them gave a bad report. Well, they said, yeah, the land is flowing with milk and honey, and, you know, look at the grapes we brought back. The cluster of grapes that they brought back had to be carried by two people, and the clusters hung on a pole between two men as they carried them back. But they said there's giants in the land. And, you know, we can't overcome the giants. We can't overcome these walled cities. And there were two, Caleb and Joshua, that said, no, if God's with us, who's going to stand against us? Let's go. But the 10 spies convinced the people, and they basically rejected what God told them to do. But before we get into today's study, as we'll pick up right there, you could call it a trivia question to ask. And it pertains to today's study. What does the Israeli flag and an ambulance have in common? Nobody knows. Well, can anybody describe for me the Israeli flag? Nope. It's white and blue. It's a white flag with a blue cross of what you would call the Star of David in the middle, and there's a large blue stripe across the top and a large blue stripe across the bottom. And if you look at the side of not only an ambulance, but pretty much any medical insignia, you'll see a snake wrapped around a pole. Now you think, what do those two things have to have in common? Well, the blue stripes on the Jewish flag are reminders for the Hebrews to obey the Lord. And we see that in Numbers chapter 15, 38 through 41. And the serpent on a pole on the side of an ambulance and other medical things is a reminder of the salvation of God provided for his people after they sinned. And that is found in Numbers chapter 21, 8 and 9. And both of these passages from which those symbols are drawn are going to be part of our study today, or lesson today. And again, the focus today is on God's power. What he says he will do because he's powerful enough to do what he says. As we begin our study, again, we see Israel at the doorstep of the promised land. They have now rejected God and rejected his gift. And because of that, God condemns Israel to wander 40 years or spend 40 years in the wilderness. And as we start today, we're going to look at Israel's rebellions. And the first that we're going to look at is them attempting to enter the promised land. Go to Numbers chapter 14. Numbers chapter 14, and we'll see God condemning Israel to wander in the wilderness because of their rejection of not only his gift of the promised land, but of him. Numbers 14, starting at verse 28. I'm going to read 28 through 35. Say unto them, as truly as I live, saith the Lord, as ye have spoken in my ears, so will I do it to you. Your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness, and all that were numbered of you according to your whole number, from 20 years old and upward, which have murmured against me. Doubtless ye shall not come into the land concerning which I swear to make you dwell therein, save Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. But your little ones, which ye said should be a prey, them will I bring in, and they shall know the land which ye have despised. But as for you, your carcasses, they shall fall in this wilderness, and your children shall wander in the wilderness 40 years, and bear your whoredoms until your carcasses be wasted in the wilderness. After the number of days in which ye search the land, even 40 days, each for a year shall ye bear your iniquities, even 40 years, and ye shall know my breach of promise. As I, the Lord, have said, I will surely do unto all this evil congregation that are gathered together against me in this wilderness, they shall be consumed, and there they shall die. So because of their rejection of God and not taking the land, and then murmuring against God, God condemned Israel to spend 40 years in the wilderness. And not only that, but everyone of 20 years of age and older would die in the wilderness, except for two. Those two spies who brought back a good report, Caleb and Joshua. All the others were going to die in the wilderness. Their children would take the promised land, but not them. And they would wander for 40 years, 1 year for each day that the spies were in the land. They were in the land for 40 days, so 40 years in the wilderness, wandering around. Now, the people tried to change God's decision by invading the promised land after he handed down this death sentence. Let's continue our reading, verse 39 through 45 of chapter 14. And Moses told these sayings unto all the children of Israel, and the people mourned greatly. Excuse me. And they rose up early in the morning and gat them up to the top of the mountain, saying, Lo, we be here, and we will go up unto the place which the Lord hath promised, for we have sinned. And Moses said, Wherefore now do ye transgress the commandment of the Lord? But it shall not prosper. Go not up, for the Lord is not among you, and be not smitten, and that ye be not smitten before your enemies. For the Amalekites and the Canaanites are there before you, and ye shall fall by the sword, because ye are turned away from the Lord. Therefore the Lord will not be with you. But they presumed to go up unto the hilltop. Nevertheless, the ark of the covenant of the Lord and Moses departed not out of the camp. Then the Amalekites came down, and the Canaanites which dwell in the hill, and smote them, and discomfited them, even unto Hormah. So the people thought, well, okay, well, we'll go in, God. You know, we're sorry, we sinned, we'll go in. God said, nope, not now. You missed your chance. You are under judgment now. And so they tried to change God's mind or they tried to overcome his sentence by going into the land. The only thing it proved is they were slaughtered there. They didn't have to wander anywhere. Those that went up didn't have to wander in the wilderness. They were killed there. They learned about their ability to overcome God's will, that they had no power to do that. What God says will come true. But God's ban on the promised land wasn't going to be forever. And when it came time for the Israelites to enter the land, there was going to be nobody that would be able to keep them out. Right now, there was no way that they could go in. But in the right timing, there was no one that was going to keep them out. And we know that that this was temporary because God continued to give Moses instructions about Israel's worship of him in the land that he was giving to them. And God also gave some, in the following passages here, some additional laws concerning unintentional sins and presumptuous sins. And then we see another rebellion, so to speak, here, and it's breaking the Sabbath. Now, they had been instructed to keep the Sabbath, but there had been really no instructions on what to do if somebody broke the Sabbath. And we see that here in chapter 15 now, in the verses 32 through 41. Some in the congregation found a man collecting sticks on the Sabbath. That was breaking the Sabbath. They brought him into a ward or some kind of, we might call it a jail, but some kind of holding place, because they really didn't have, they knew that breaking the Sabbath was wrong, but they hadn't had any clear instructions on what was to happen to someone who broke the Sabbath. And if you look in passage, the verses 32 through 36 of chapter 15, the sentence for breaking the Sabbath was stoning. They were to be put to death by stoning. And they put this man to death according to God's command. They stoned him. Now, the Israelites obviously were to take God's commands seriously. And they did here, which was a serious command. You think, oh, he was picking up some sticks. No, he was breaking the Sabbath. God's command was clear. Remember the Sabbath day. For the Israelites, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. No work was to be done on the Sabbath day. He did work. And the punishment for that was death. So God gave them here a way to remember their need to obey him. Numbers chapter 15, verse 37. I'm going to read for you verse 37 through 41. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make them fringes in the borders of their garments throughout their generations, and that they put upon the fringe of the borders a riband of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that ye look upon it, and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them, that ye seek not after your own heart, and not on your own heart or your own eyes, and your own eyes after which ye use to go a-whoring, that ye may remember and do all my commandments, and be holy unto your God. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God, and I am the Lord your God. And here's where we get the blue stripes on the Israeli flag. Now, if you ask those who came up with the flag, if they knew what it was for, they probably wouldn't necessarily know. But those blue stripes on their garments were to remind them every time they saw them, we need to obey God's commands. And why did they need a reminder all the time? Why was it on their clothing? Why the reminder? Verse 39 says they needed a reminder because their hearts and eyes were inclined to commit spiritual harlotry by going after other gods. It was a daily reminder. You need to be obedient to God because their tendency was to go after other gods. And then we come to the next rebellion, and it was a rebellion against Moses and Aaron, and that's in chapter 16 and 17. The events here that are recorded after God gave instructions for the blue ribbons in their garments and their fringes proved why Israel needed them. There's a man by the name of Korah. He was a Levite. He led a rebellion of the Reubenites and other, what it's described as men of reputation, and he accused Moses and Aaron of exalting themselves above the rest of the people. And he criticized Moses specifically for acting like a prince over them. Chapter 16, verse 3. And they gathered themselves together against Moses and against Aaron, and said unto them, Ye take too much upon you, seeing all the congregation are holy, and every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Wherefore then lift ye up yourselves above the congregation of the Lord. And then go down to verse 13, same chapter. It says, Is it a small thing that thou hast brought us up out of the land that floweth with milk and honey, to kill us in the wilderness? Except thou make thyself altogether a prince over us. So Korah leads this rebellion. And basically he's accusing Moses and Aaron of bringing them out of the land, quote unquote, of milk and honey, to kill them in the wilderness, and in the meantime, act as princes over them. You know, basically saying that you took that upon yourselves, being in charge. And they went on to say, well, aren't all of us holy? You know, why are you the leaders? Why aren't any of the rest of us? And it's probably no doubt Korah's ambition was to garner enough support to overthrow both Moses and Aaron. And since his generation was already condemned to die in the wilderness, perhaps he and his fellow rebels thought they could change the curse if they got rid of their leaders. You know, maybe we can change the outcome of this 40 years wandering in the wilderness if we change who we're following. They blamed, again, Moses for taking them out of Egypt in what they described as a land of milk and honey, flowing with milk and honey. And they also blamed him for failing to bring him into the land of milk and honey, the promised land. God didn't let this go unjudged. God judged Korah and his two fellow rebels by opening up the earth to swallow them. Let's read chapter 16. I'm going to read for you verses 28 through 33. And Moses said, Hereby ye shall know that the Lord hath sent me to do all these works, for I have not done them of mine own mind. If these men die the common death of all men, or if they be visited after the visitation of all men, then the Lord hath not sent me. But if the Lord make a new thing, and the earth open up her mouth and swallow them up with all that appertain unto them, and they go down quick into the pit, then ye shall understand that these men have provoked the Lord. And it came to pass, as he had made an end of speaking all these words, that the ground clave asunder that was under them, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up and their houses, and all the men that appertained unto Korah, and all their goods. So Moses, under God's direction, says to him, okay, you'll see if these men, if nothing happens to these men, they die a normal death, then God hasn't sent me. But if God has sent and put put myself and Aaron in charge, then let God do a new thing. Let him open up the earth and swallow them up. What do you think happened? The earth opened up, swallowed them up, all their servants, all their possessions. Everything all the men that appertained to them, or all the people that appertained to them, their families, everything swallowed up. And then remember, there were these respectable men that followed Korah. The rest of them that questioned Moses were struck by God's fire. Verse 34 here in chapter 16. And all Israel that were round about them fled at the cry of them, for they said, Lest the earth swallow us up also. And there came out a fire from the Lord and consumed the 250 men that offered incense. These were those respectable men that also questioned Moses and Aaron and followed after Korah. The judgment was a sign to the rest of Israel that Moses was leader, not by his own will, but by the will of God. He was not self-appointed. And this crisis proved again that God's will can't be thwarted. Korah tried to take control, God says, no, I put Moses in charge. But the people, again, failed to learn the lesson. They blamed Moses and Aaron for killing people of the Lord. You see that in verse 41 there. And God plagued them until Aaron mercifully intervened. We see that in verses 42 through 50. And God then proved Aaron was his choice to be priest by producing blossoms on Aaron's rod, and Aaron's rod brought forth almonds, while the rods of all the other tribes remained dead. Again, God's will not be overcome. And then we come to Moses' rebellion in Numbers chapter 20. And we don't have a day-by-day record of the 40 years wandering around in the wilderness. We don't have a lot of information on that time, but what is recorded during that time is important. And there's no event greater than Moses' rebellion at Kadesh. Now, at this point in time, the nation is most likely nearing the end of their wilderness time, and they complained again about not having water. And once again, God told Moses that water would come from a rock. But this time, Moses was to speak to the rock. Remember the last time God brought water forth out of a rock, he told Moses to strike the rock. This time Moses was to speak to the rock, and God would bring water forth. Problem was, Moses hit the rock twice with his rod, not following God's instructions. Chapter 20, let me read verse 8 through 11. Take thy rod and gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes. It shall give forth his water, and thou shalt bring forth to them water out of the rock. So thou shalt give the congregation and their beasts to drink. And Moses took the rod from before the Lord, as he had commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock, and he said unto them, Hear ye now, ye rebels. Must we fetch water out of this rock? Must we fetch you water out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice, and the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. You see here in Moses talking to the people before he struck the rock, had a little bit of an attitude. Whether he was frustrated with the people, or was he frustrated with God for not judging them for complaining again? We don't know. But he struck the rock. Now, what was the big deal? Other than the fact he blatantly disobeyed God, what was the big deal? There was a reason that God wanted him to speak to the rock. It was setting up a picture of the Messiah, of Christ. Christ died once. That was the striking of the first rock, and it brought forth water, living water. The second time, he was to speak to the rock, showing a picture of after salvation, we don't need to crucify Christ every time. We just need to speak to him for forgiveness. He died once, not twice, not multiple times, not every time we have communion. One death, and then forgiveness comes by asking, by speaking. So Moses blatantly disobeyed God, struck the rock twice, water came forth, but because he had not hallowed God before the congregation, God was not going to allow Moses and Aaron to enter the promised land. For some reason, Moses failed to believe God, called the people rebels, and again asking them if he needed to fetch water from the rock for them. It's just kind of an attitude that he had there. And hit the rock in anger instead of speaking to the rock, and it was a rebellious act against God. Verse 12 of chapter 20. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, because ye believe me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. See, Moses was sending a message to the people here that it was not particularly important to submit to God's will. And after all the time they've spent, and Moses' time has spent as leader of these people, you would have thought he would have at least learned submitting to God's will every time in every way was important. And by him not submitting to God's will here, he was sending a message to the people. It's not important to submit, because I struck the rock, even though I'm supposed to speak to it. You got water. But there was a consequence for it. Moses and Aaron were no longer going to be able to go into the land of promised land. So after the nation journeyed from Kadesh to Mount Hor, it was time for Aaron to die. He ascended Mount Hor with his son Eleazar and Moses, and there Moses stripped Aaron of his priestly garments and passed them to Eleazar. And Aaron died shortly thereafter. We see that in chapter 20, verses 23 through 29. Israel then defeated the Canaanites at Hormah before the journey got long and laborious in 21, verse 1 through 4. And again, they complained. They complained about what God had been giving them, manna, and about what God hadn't given them, water. And this time, God did judge them. He sent deadly snakes into the camp. Chapter 21, verse 5. I'm going to read for you 5 and 6. And the people spake against God and against Moses, wherefore have ye brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, neither is there any water, and our soul loatheth this light bread. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much of Israel died. The consequence of them complaining, God sent fiery serpents, venomous snakes into the camp. And when they bit people, people died. And God told, and the people cried out, well, let's continue our reading. Verse 7 through 9. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord, against thee, and against thee. Pray unto the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. And Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said unto Moses, make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole. And it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, it shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass, and put it on a pole. And it came to pass that if the serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. So God told Moses, when the people cried out for mercy, basically, and confessed their sin again, God told Moses, you erect a bronze serpent, put it on a pole high up so people could see it, and when they're bitten, if they look at the serpent on the pole, they won't die. And there's your next part of that trivia question on the ambulances, the serpent on a pole. We have a hymn in our hymnal, Look and Live, basically based, again, on this passage. And it wasn't, for years I thought, well, that's kind of strange. God told them not to worship idols and that he made something for them to look on so they could live. That's not what it was. This is a picture, again, of Christ on the cross. The brass, the brass is a symbol of judgment in the Bible. This brass serpent on a pole was the judgment of sin upon Christ. And people need to look to him for that salvation, just as the Israelites here looked to that serpent for life. Now, perhaps the judgment and the salvation were a lesson for Moses, too, as he neared his death. He could trust God to be just and merciful and gracious. All of those part of God's glory, the glory that he had shown Moses way back on Mount Sinai. And then we come to Balaam's futility. Now, as Israel continues on, a new character kind of enters the narrative here. A man by the name of Balaam. Balaam was a notable diviner. He was familiar to multiple ancient people groups, and his notoriety spilled even into the New Testament, where 2 Peter 2:15 and Jude 11 present him as a negative example of profiting from evil. And multiple other passages condemn Balaam. But the portion of Scripture here focuses, or the focus here of this portion of Scripture is on Balaam as a foreigner who knew God by his covenantal name. He blessed Israel and gave messianic prophecies. Now, God did directly chastise Balaam for pursuing gain from Balak, who was the king of Moab. Now, Balaam, as I've already described him, you can see he's a complicated character. But God's message through the account of Balaam here is clear. No one can ever overpower or outsmart God. And as we start out this narrative, we see Balak's summons. He summoned Balaam. Numbers chapter 22. Let me read for you verses 1 through 4. And the children of Israel set forward and pitched in the plains of Moab on this side Jordan by Jericho. And Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. And Moab was sore afraid of the people because they were many. And Moab was distressed because of the children of Israel. And Moab said unto the elders of the Midians, Now shall this company lick up all that are round about us, as the ox licketh up the grass of the field. And Balak, the son of Zippor, was king of the Moabites at that time. You look here, what do you think Balak's frame of mind towards Israel was at this point in time? Well, he feared Israel because of their large population. All he saw was this huge group of people, and he was a little bit afraid. Hey, we already saw what they did to these guys. What if they turn their focus on us? Let's continue our reading in Deuteronomy, over in Deuteronomy chapter 2 for a second, if you'll turn there. Deuteronomy chapter 2. And the question we're going to answer here in Deuteronomy chapter 2 is, did Balak need to fear Israel? Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 8 and 9. Deuteronomy 2, verse 8. And when we passed by from our brethren the children of Esau, which dwelt in Seir, through the way of the plain of the Elath, and from the Ezalon Gaber, we turned and passed by the way of the wilderness of Moab. And the Lord said unto me, Distress not the Moabites, neither contend with them in battle. For I will not give thee of their land for possession, because I have given Ar unto the children of Lot for possession. Now, obviously Balak probably didn't know this, but Balak really had nothing to fear. Moab, the Israelites were not to take Moab. This was land promised to Lot, and the Moabites were the descendants of Lot. But seeing all these people in desperation, Balak summons Balaam, this internationally known diviner who used animal entrails and nature to determine God's will. And he also cursed and blessed people to try and to influence the gods. Chapter 22 of Numbers again, verse 5 and 6. 22, verse 5 and 6. He sent messengers, therefore, unto Balaam, the son of Beor, to Pethor, which is by the river of the land of the children of this people, to call him, saying, Behold, there is a people come out of Egypt. Behold, they cover the face of the earth, and they abide over against us. Come now, therefore, I pray thee, curse me this people, for they are too mighty for me. Peradventure I shall prevail that we may smite them, and that I may drive them out of the land. For I wot not that he whom thou blessest is blessed, and he whom thou cursest is cursed. Balak was pretty confident in Balaam's ability to influence the course of history. He firmly believed that Balaam's blessings and curses were always effective. But he was not completely sure that even Balaam's sure curse on Israel would guarantee him victory in battle. Balak believed that maybe if Israel was cursed, then Moab and Midian would have a chance to defeat Israel despite the apparent odds. Balak's words about Balaam's blessings and curses are similar to God's words to Abram in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. Go there with me if you would. Genesis 12, verse 3. Balak said that whoever Balaam cursed would be cursed, whoever he blessed would be blessed. Let's look at Genesis chapter 12, what God said to Abram. 12, verse 3 of Genesis. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So what did God say that would happen to those who cursed Abram? They'd be cursed themselves. So Balaam, right from the get-go, wasn't going to be effective in cursing Israel, because if he did, he would curse himself. That's not only the message to Balaam, but to all who bless Abram or curse Abram. Those who bless Abram and his descendants would be blessed. Those who curse Abram and his descendants would be cursed. So if Balaam cursed Israel, he'd be, in a sense, cursing himself. Now, Balak sent two entourages to Balaam, attempting to convince him to accept the job of cursing Israel. But God met with Balaam before he responded to each request. And God instructed Balaam to deny the first request. However, God allowed Balaam to accept the second request with the understanding to do only what God said. See that in Numbers chapter 22, verse 20. Now, there was a negotiation between Balaam and Balak's emissaries. And a lot of people think this was just Balaam trying to get more money for going. But nevertheless, Balaam rose up early and went with the princes of Moab. And God was angry, we see in verse 22. And it's sort of surprising because God allowed him to go, but then he's angry that he went. Now, the best explanation is to allow other passages to aid our understanding. Both 2 Peter 2:15 and Jude 11 criticize Balaam for gaining from wrongdoing. Now, it's evident that Balaam was motivated more by a desire for riches than by doing what God said, or than doing what God wanted him to do. And although Balaam had met with God in some kind of a fashion, he apparently believed he could override God's will and gain financially. For him, he thought it was a win-win. Then we see Balaam's arrival in chapter 22, verses 23 through 40. Now, the account here of Balaam and his donkey is probably one of the most comical pictures in the Bible. 3 times the angel of the Lord stood in front of the donkey, causing it to pause. Let's turn to chapter 22, or read verse 23 through 34. And the ass saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way, and his sword drawn in his hand, and the ass turned aside out of the way and went into the field, and Balaam smote the ass to turn her into the way. But the angel of the Lord stood in the path of the vineyards, but the angel of the Lord stood in a path of the vineyards, a wall being on this side and a wall on the left side. And when the ass saw the angel of the Lord, she thrust herself into the wall and crushed Balaam's foot against the wall, and he smote her again. And the angel of the Lord went further and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn either to the right hand or to the left. And when the ass saw the angel of the Lord, she fell down under Balaam, and Balaam's anger was kindled, and he smote the ass with a staff. And the Lord opened the mouth of the ass, and she said unto Balaam, What have I done unto thee that thou hast smitten me these 3 times? And Balaam said unto the ass, Because thou hast mocked me. I would that there were a sword in my hand, for I would now kill thee. And the ass said unto Balaam, Am I not thine ass? Am not I thine ass, upon which thou hast ridden over since I was thine unto this day? Was I ever wont to do so unto thee? And he said, Nay. And the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way, and his sword drawn in his hand. And he bowed down his head and fell flat on his face. And the angel of the Lord said unto him, Wherefore hast thou smitten thine ass these 3 times? Behold, I went out to withstand thee, because thy way is perverse before me. And the ass saw me and turned from me these 3 times. Unless she had turned from me, surely now also I had slain thee and saved her alive. And Balaam said unto the angel of the Lord, I have sinned, for I knew not that thou wast stood in the way against me. Now therefore, if it displease thee, I will get me back again. And the angel of the Lord said unto Balaam, Go with the men, but only the word that I shall speak unto thee, that thou shalt speak. So Balaam went with the princes of Balak. There is so many things comical about this. It's ridiculous. But the biggest thing is, it's showing us how, in this comical true account, it's showing how ridiculous it is of someone believing he can override God's control. He can either override God or control God. That's just as comical as talking to his donkey, or his donkey talking to him. There's no way he can override what God said, or he can control God. And then we come to Balaam's oracles. When the diviner met the king, Balak asked Balaam to curse Israel. However, Balaam, constrained by God, blessed Israel, and that cycle was repeated 3 times. Now, prior to the first 2 oracles of blessing, Balaam performed some elaborate sacrificial ritual. And the contrast between Balaam's sacrificial ritual and God's instructions for sacrifice in Numbers chapter 15 highlight Balaam's actions as a pagan. But even though Balaam was a pagan, God used him in a significant way. Balaam's oracles blessed Israel and prophesied of the Messiah. And the 3rd oracle is expanded to include the 3rd major poem of the Pentateuch. Let's look at these oracles. Balaam's first oracle. And this first oracle highlights the inability to fulfill the assignment of cursing Israel. Balaam instead blessed Israel, and Balaam's words of blessing, though, were not from him, they were from God. Numbers chapter 23, let me read verse 7 through 10. And he took up his parable and said, Balak the king of Moab hath brought me from Aram, out of the mountains of the east, saying, Come and curse me Jacob, and come defy Israel. How shall I curse whom God hath not cursed? Or how shall I defy whom the Lord hath not defiled? For from the top of the rocks I see him, and from the hills I behold him. Lo, the people shall dwell alone and shall not be reckoned among the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob and the number of the fourth part of Israel? Let me die the death of the righteous, and let my last end be like this. The first blessing is connected to God's covenantal promises to the patriarchs. We see that in those promises made in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, Genesis 26, 1 through 5, and Genesis 35, 9 through 15. Balaam's blessing here recognized that God was blessing Israel. And even if Balaam were to utter words of cursing, he could not change God's favorable disposition towards Israel. And this blessing was especially concerned with the promises that Israel would be a great nation. And we see a rhetorical question here in this oracle, this Balaam's, regarding Israel's population. That's in verse 10 there. It kind of parallels God's promise to make Israel as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. And Balaam even added here that he wished he could be part of Israel and take part in their blessing. Well, how did Balak respond to Balaam here? Verse 11 of chapter 23. And Balak said unto Balaam, What hast thou done to me? I took thee to curse mine enemies, and behold, thou hast blessed them altogether. And he answered and said, Must I not take heed to speak that which the Lord hath put in my mouth? Balak said, What are you doing? I brought you here to curse, and you blessed him. Balaam says, I can only speak the words that the Lord puts in my mouth. Now, Balaam's actions throughout this extended text, they do not indicate that he became a genuine believer. But for moments, at least during this time, Balaam understood that God could not be overpowered or outsmarted. And then we come to Balaam's second oracle in Numbers chapter 23, verse 18 through 24. Let me read that for you. And he took up his parable and said, Rise up, Balak, and hear, hearken unto me, thou son of Zippor. God is not a man that he should lie, neither the son of man that he should repent. Hath he said, and shall he not do it? Or hath he spoken, shall he not make it good? Behold, I have received commandments to bless, and he hath blessed, and I cannot reverse it. He hath not beheld iniquity of Jacob, neither hath he seen perverseness in Israel. The Lord God is with him, and the shout of the king is among them. God brought them out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. Surely there is no enchantment against Jacob, neither is there any divination against Israel. According this time it shall be said of Jacob and Israel, What hath God wrought? Behold, the people shall rise up as a great lion and lift himself as a young lion. He shall not lie down until he eat of prey and drink of the blood of the slain. Now, Balaam begins his second oracle by focusing Balak's attention on God's immutability, his unchanging nature. God does not change. God promised Abraham and his descendants a land, seed, and blessing, and God could never renege on those promises. He could never replace a blessing with a curse. God was always faithful. Again, God gave Balaam the words of this oracle, and the repeated emphasis on blessing throughout this passage reminds us of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Israel's dual role as being blessed of God and blesser of others. How did they bless others? Because through their descendants came the Messiah to bless the entire world. This oracle focused on Israel's great strength in contrast to the first oracle, which focused on Israel's large population. Numbers 23:22 compares Israel to a unicorn, rhinoceros, strength. The emphasis on Israel's strength creates another connection with Israel's Egyptian experience. Remember, the midwives said, they couldn't kill the babies because the Hebrew women were mighty or strong and vigorous, and they delivered their babies quickly, it went right back to work. And then Moses, when he was recounting this, went on to say he applied that strength to all of Israel in Exodus chapter 1, 19 and 20. This oracle also says that no sorcery or divination would work against Israel. God had already blessed Israel. Nothing could change that. And there are no loopholes through which God could be overpowered or outsmarted. And the last part of the second oracle compares Israel to a hunting or conquering lion that won't lie down until it drinks the blood of the slain. And probably that description sent chills through Balak, because he's thinking they're coming after him and his people, the Moabites. Now, Balak's initial response to Balaam's second oracle was to have him shut up. Look, if you can't say something bad, don't say anything. Normally we're thinking that the other way. If you can't say something good, don't say anything. But in this situation, Balak basically is saying to Balaam, hey, if you can't say anything bad, don't speak. I don't need you blessing them anymore. But Balaam again showed the fault in this strategy by saying, hey, I can only say what God has given him to say. He could not overpower God. And then we come to Balaam's third oracle. And I will hurry. I'm sorry. chapter 24, verses 3 through 9. He took up his parable and said, Balaam the son of Beor has said, the man whose eyes are open has said, he has said, which heard the words of God, which saw the vision of the Almighty falling into a trance, but having his eyes open. How goodly are thy tents, O Jacob, and thy tabernacles, O Israel. As the valleys are they spread forth, as gardens by the riverside, and the trees of lin aloes, which the Lord hath planted, and as cedar trees beside the waters. He shall pour the water out of his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters, and his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. God brought him forth out of Egypt, he as it were the strength of a unicorn. He shall eat up the nations, his enemies, and shall break their bones, and pierce them through with his arrows. He crouched, he lay down as a lion, and as a great lion, who shall stir him up? Blessed is he that blessed thee, and cursed is he that curseth thee. Now, at first glance, this third oracle sounds and appears really similar to the second. And many of the same observations made in the second oracle are made here again in the third. But there's a significant change here, or a significant difference. And it's a change in the pronouns. And that's not the type of pronouns we're talking about in this day and age. There are mysterious references here to him in chapter 24, 3 through 9, and that refers to a future Messiah. This understanding is supported by the expansion of the third oracle in verses 15 through 24, and those verses are about the latter days, we see in verse 14. Again, Balak was livid with Balaam, slapped his hands together for effect, and told Balaam to go home without payment. Balaam reiterated he had to speak what God said, even if it meant he would be working for free. And as Balaam departed, he gave a final addendum to the cycle of the three oracles. And this final poem is the third major poem in the Pentateuch, and the second introduced with a focus on the last days. Chapter 24, verses 15 through 24. And he took up his parable and said, Balaam the son of Beor hath said, and the man whose eyes are open hath said, he has said, which heard the words of God and knew the knowledge of the Most High, which saw the vision of the Almighty falling into a trance, and having his eyes open. I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Sheth. And Edom shall be a possession, Seir shall be a possession for his enemies, and Israel shall do valiantly. Out of Jacob shall come he that shall have dominion, and shall destroy him that remaineth of the city. And when he looked upon Amalek, he took up his parable and said, Amalek was the first of the nations, but his latter end shall be that he perish forever. And he looked on the Kenites, and took up his parable, and said, Strong is thy dwelling place, and thou puttest thy nest in rock. Nevertheless, the Kenites shall be wasted, until Asher shall carry thee away captive. And he took up his parable, and said, Alas, who shall live when God doeth this? And ships shall come from the coast of Chittim, and shall affect Asher, and shall afflict Eber, and he shall perish forever. And Balaam rose up and went and returned unto his place, and Balak also his way. Look at the descriptors it's using for the person of this oracle. The star out of Jacob, a scepter, one who will have dominion, one who will dispossess and destroy his enemies. This poem resumes a focus found earlier in Genesis chapter 49. The events described should generate a longing for the fulfillment of these prophetic utterances. You know, this is talking about what Christ is going to do in the latter days. Balaam's description of an individual who is coming but not yet near points to that Messiah. This verse says that the scepter will not depart from Judah, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And the two poems, the one in Genesis and the one here in Numbers, are obvious in referring to the same individual, that promised Messiah. The reference to the individual as a victorious warrior, leader, in verses 17 through 19 here, closely parallels Genesis 49. And some of the military victories prophesied in this passage happened partly in the Old Testament, but the best explanation for this passage as a whole is to see the future fulfillment of these victories. The names Edom and Seir here could stand for general enemies of God rather than those specific nations. And as we conclude here, let's look at verse 25 of chapter 24 again. And Balaam rose up and went and returned unto his place, and Balak also his way. What do you think Balak concluded about God after listening to Balaam's oracles? Well, he probably concluded that trying to overpower God was hopeless, and that any further attempts would just make the situation worse. Now, God's words through Balaam should strengthen our faith in God. He clearly demonstrated that he cannot be overpowered or outsmarted. He communicated that God cannot lie nor go back on his word. And that means a lot to us when we consider the prophetic tone of that last oracle of Balaam. The Messiah did come, and he's coming again to set up his kingdom on earth. That is settled. No one or nothing can change God's words, and we can put our faith in him with complete confidence. Let's close in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, again, we thank you for this day and this time that we can spend in your word. Father, we just pray that we are encouraged by the promises that you've made that Christ will come again and set up his kingdom here on this earth. And we know that you don't change and your promises don't change, so we can look forward to that as fact, not as wishful thinking. Father, be with us in this upcoming week. We just pray that we would be the people you've called us to be, and it's in your precious name we pray. Amen.